Hello everyone, this is Scarzig, and with the Legends of Runeterra closed beta right around the corner, these powerful yet overlooked cards could be the key to giving you the advantage you need to rack up those wins in your upcoming games. Today, I want to bring your attention to some powerful cards that went overlooked during the preview event. Now, players might have been distracted by some of the more obvious powerful cards or archetypes that were included during the preview event, or simply they adopted those popular decks too quickly before exploring these other options. Some of these cards were only played in their intended decks or archetypes, but might be strong enough to see more widespread application. Suffice to say, keep these cards in mind when you're building your decks during the upcoming beta. So first up, from Demacia, we have Dawn Speakers. Now, this is a 3-mana 1/4 that at the end of the round, it grants your other allies +1/+1 if an ally died this round. Now, this card got a lot of mileage during the first preview event because of its ability to snowball a board, and then it settled into a token slash self-sacrifice archetype and generally sort of fell off the longer the preview events went. But combat in Runeterra is still near constant, and that means that it still has that same snowball potential. So give this card a shot if you haven't already, and you'll see how easy it is for it to still take over the game. If you get two Dawn Speakers in play at the same time, then they're both proccing off of one another, and it's off to the races from there. Next up from Demacia, we have Detain, a 5-mana spell that captures an enemy unit. Now, this card was recently buffed to 5 mana from 6, and it took me building a mono Demacia deck for me to really appreciate the power of this card and to give it a shot. The effect is very strong in certain matchups, but very mediocre in others. If your opponent has a lot of removal, of course, Detain is not going to see a lot of use or get you a lot of value. Because the way Detain works, the way the capture mechanic works, is that you select an ally unit and then you select an enemy unit. The enemy unit is removed from the board for as long as that ally unit remains on the board. So as long as you can keep that ally alive, your enemy is denied one of their potential units or one of their potential threats against you. So because the value of this deck goes up and down so wildly depending on the matchup, and since you're incentivized to keep the detaining unit alive, you might just kill your tempo if you stop attacking with it. So all in all, this card is very powerful still, but it's also very skill testing. So certainly not for the faint of heart. Moving on from Demacia, we also have the Radiant Guardian. It's a 5-mana 5/5 that when you summon it, if an ally had died in that round, it gains lifesteal and tough. Lifesteal meaning that the damage it deals also heals your Nexus, and tough means that it takes one less from every instance of damage. So very, very tanky, very, very defensive stat line here. And I feel like players might have gotten scared off by the fact that its keywords are conditional, but again, combat is very frequent in Runeterra, and it's not difficult to get this unit into play along with its keywords. There's been many a game where Radiant Guardian has stabilized my board, and it just absolutely seals out the game against aggressive decks. You're going to be doing a lot of defensive trading in that regard anyway against an aggressive deck. So Radiant Guardian coming down with tough, meaning it's an even stronger defender, and its ability to just heal your Nexus repeatedly means that more aggressive decks aren't going to be able to get through this big boy without hard removal. So with that all being said, I think that Radiant Guardian probably should be an auto-include in any region or any deck that is running Demacia as well. So moving on to Freljord, we have Stalking Wolf first up. This is a 2-mana 3/2 with Challenger, and when it's summoned, it summons a Snow Hare on the enemy side. The Snow Hare is simply a 1/1. So Challenger, I feel, is one of the most underutilized keywords right now. It is very powerful. Its applications are very varied. But again, it's just something that doesn't find its way into as many decks as it should. There's a couple gimme units like Fleet Feather Tracker, for example, that are just too strong not to include, but Challenger, as it exists as a wider keyword in the game, I think deserves much more love. Challenger serves as an excellent stand-in for decks that need more removal, as well as to help out regions that lack hard removal altogether. Stalking Wolf's downside to summon a 1/1 for the enemy is, in my opinion, very small for the pressure that it provides. You aren't necessarily going to play this card on 2 mana to aggressively attack the opponent the way you might do with other units with a similar stat line and mana cost, but using Stalking Wolf to supplement an existing board of 1 to 2 units will gain you some excellent pressure. Next up from the Freljord, we have the 3 mana 2/4 Scarthane Stefan. Now, when Stefan survives damage, it gets +3 attack. Now, this card comes down early enough to be a decent body already, but it puts very interesting pressure on your opponent because attacking and defending against it become very awkward for them because they don't want it to get buffed. So damage-based removal spells aren't a clean answer to it either. So there is potential for this card to get a lot of very strong value in terms of just trading up into larger units or threatening your opponent with a lot of face damage that they're scrambling to figure out what to do with. So there's not a lot to say here with this unit, but it definitely deserves to be included in way more decks than it was going forward. Next up from Freljord, we have the Rime-Tusk Shaman. It's a 5 mana 3/3 that at the start of each round frostbites the strongest enemy. Now, frostbite is a mechanic that means that you're setting the unit down to 0 attack. It can still participate in combat and defend, of course, but the fact that it's not going to be dealing any damage for a round makes Rime-Tusk Shaman a very useful tool for pressing an advantage or potentially defending against an opponent that can't properly deal with this card using removal. And because the stat line is so borderline, it is one of the less recommended picks for this list. But I feel that a repeatedly occurring free ability like this definitely deserves a second look. If you've been experimenting with Freljord or you want something that can really add some spice, I think that Rime-Tusk Shaman definitely deserves a second look, and I look forward to experimenting with this card myself and throwing it into the mix along with some other mid-range units. So next, we're moving on to Ionia, and the first card we have from that region is Ghost, a 1 mana burst spell that grants an ally elusive for this round. So one of the reasons I feel this card was overlooked is that it's just in the wrong region. Ionia is full of elusive units already. However, this card does still have a lot going for it. It's essentially a 1 mana burn spell. Because it's burst speed, you can cast it on a unit that you want to be able to strike the opponent's Nexus directly, and then immediately enter combat before they can play a defender. Now, this card will be useful, or I should say a removal spell, because elusive means that the unit can't be blocked anyway. So this card is going to be useful for getting in that last bit of damage that you might need, and it's only going to go up in value if aggro Ionia begins to rise up in popularity. It might even make the cut in ephemeral aggro, but time will tell. Next up from Ionia, we have Recall. It's a 1 mana fast spell that recalls an ally. Now, recalling an ally simply means to return the ally from the board to your hand. Now, this card, as you can see, has a lot of potential uses and a lot of utility. It's currently only really seeing play in the Yasuo Recall and Stun synergy-based deck, but again, the utility of this card, I feel, makes it strong enough to see play in a broader sense. By sending an ally back to your hand as they're being targeted by a removal spell, right? They're gonna be killed anyway. Means that you can simply play 1 mana to gain another use out of that unit. It's sort of like you denied the enemy spell, but you can think of it more as maybe 1 mana draw a card, or maybe 1 mana fully heal a unit. So again, the ability for you to send the unit back to your hand in order to avoid unfavorable combat situations or your opponent's removal options, for again, just 1 mana means that this card can really, really get you some strong value and some strong tempo in the upcoming beta. So moving forward, we do have the Kinko Lifeblade, also from Ionia. It's a 4 mana 2/3 with Elusive and Lifesteal. And like Rhymetusk Shaman, this card just barely intrigues me enough to suggest it here. The potential for repeatable healing coupled with repeated damage to the opponent's face is something I've encountered in card games before, and it has certainly felt strong then. So the way I go about evaluating Lifeblade is this. If Kinko Lifeblade had +1/+1 to its stat line, if it was a 3/4, it would be a no-brainer, right? This card would be absolutely busted. So the fact that it's only a 2/3, I think means that it's still pretty legit. So it's good for its base stats, for its repeatable damage and healing, and if you're able to buff this unit's stats in any way, I feel like it's going to make it a real killer for plenty an Ionian deck. So moving on to Noxus. There is only one card currently in Noxus I felt that deserved to see play in a broader sense, and that is the 6 mana 6/6 Minotaur Reckoner. At the start of the round, the Minotaur stuns the weakest enemy, and stunned units cannot attack or defend. So similar to other cards on this list, Minotaur Reckoner is only included in a particular archetype, right? A stun focused deck. But I know from personal experience that even if your opponent isn't getting additional value from the stun, it's still a very oppressive and a very valuable effect to have. Your opponent has one less attacking unit or potentially one less defending unit to help them survive against your onslaught. So a continuous free effect like this, coupled with an excellent stat line, would make this a fantastic threat for any Noxus deck that is able to reach up into the 6 mana reign here, to the higher reaches of the mana pool. So finally, moving on to Piltover and Zaun. First up, we have the 1 mana burst spell Rummage. Draws 2 cards, but in order to play it, you first have to discard 2 cards. Now, there are some cards that have existed in other games in the past that are sort of similar to this and have been very powerful. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has Graceful Charity, and Magic the Gathering's famous example, Faithless Looting, are definitely the top examples. But again, you'll notice that Rummage has an important change. You discard the cards first, and then draw 2. And you also need to be able to discard those 2 cards. That is the cost. Meaning that if you have 1 card in hand or no cards in hand, you can't cast Rummage, which is definitely a downside. Typically, a card draw engine is great if you are in top deck mode and is going to allow you a way to fish through your deck for more answers. But Rummage has a different purpose, where you're able to sort of how do I put it? You're able to finagle, you're able to rig your hand in order to get some cards that might be more appropriate for your current matchup. The change to Rummage is to keep it from, of course, being a general purpose draw engine, and to make it effective only in a specific discard focused deck. But I think that a card draw engine like this will always call to the more diabolical deck builders amongst us. Because if you know your deck well enough, and you know your opponent's deck type well enough, like if you know your matchup well enough, I think that you're going to know which cards you won't need and what's going to be the best to discard. So I feel that Rummage is certainly a powerful tool, but not for the faint of heart. So only the craziest amongst you will be experimenting with Rummage, and I definitely respect you, and I'm going to be experimenting with Rummage, and probably any deck that's going to be splashing in Piltover Zaun deserves to give Rummage a look. So moving on in Piltover Zon, we sort of have a combo of cards that are very similar. That would be Shady Character, the 4-mana 1/1, where you pick a follower and you transform this card into a copy of it, and then Hextech Transmogulator, which is a 6-mana fast spell that allows you to transform a follower into another follower. So I like the potential value of these cards. The problem with cards that typically become duplicates of other cards or allow you to gain a copy of what your opponent is doing is it begs the question, why not just play something good in place of these cards? And I feel like the overall utility of these cards is being severely underrated, especially in this game, because every region is going to have strong, very powerful units that you can make use of for your own game plan, and the potential for Shady Character to maybe be a discounted version of those cards, or for Hextech Transmogulator to not just gain you a copy of an opposing threat, but to potentially, if your opponent has one big unit and one small unit, you simply turn their big unit into a small unit, and then you're able to mitigate a large threat. Or again, if you have a big threat on your side, you can use Shady Character or Hextech Transmogulator to double down on a threatening and useful unit that you've already established onto the board, potentially at a mana discount. So I feel like these two cards are going to see a lot more play, especially as more cards are introduced to the game. There's going to be more potential targets for both of these cards to let you make use of in your Piltover deck. And so the final region we're going over today is Shadow Isles. And the first card from Shadow Isles, we have the 3-mana fast spell Mist's Call, which revives a random ally that died this round. Now, Mist's Call will be at its strongest when you're able to control the outcome, which is fairly easy. And using it after one of your threatening followers or champions was killed by a spell makes it function similarly to Deny, right? It's 3 mana, your removal didn't happen. They use a removal spell on your threat, you just bring it right back to life, no harm, no foul. And I do love the potential value that this card brings, especially because if one of your unit goes down while, say, defending against an opponent's unit, you cast Mist's Call post-combat, you get them back, and then you have a fresh body that's all ready to go for your offensive turn in the next round. So Mist's Call, again, being able to mitigate the opponent's removal or re-bolster your numbers after you've defended against your opponent's offensive swing is really going to pay dividends for a lot of players. Mist's Call is going to see much more play in mid-range decks, and I've even made room for it as a sneaky necromantic inclusion in my Mono Demacia deck, simply because getting those mid-range units back at a discount really spells doom for the opponent. And the final card on today's list is Atrocity. 6 mana, kill an ally to deal damage equal to its power to anything. So this includes an enemy unit or champion, or of course, the enemy Nexus. And Atrocity is one of the more surprising inclusions on this list, and not because it's weak or unusual, but for the fact that its power, to me, seems to be so apparent, I have no clue how it got overlooked. The best outcome is, of course, that you get to hit the enemy Nexus with a powerful unit, and then you sacrifice that unit, and then you get to deal its damage to the Nexus once more. So it's like the unit got to attack twice. But its usefulness doesn't stop there, because you're able to use this card in response to enemy removal, meaning you can preemptively just kill your unit that was going to die anyway, and then deal its damage to kill a big enemy threat, or again to the Nexus directly, to whittle your opponent down and work towards that win. Getting value out of units that are going to die in combat or to removal anyway is definitely one of the milestones, the keystones of Shadow Isles play that is going to make them very difficult to deal with going forward. Because Runeterra is a game that also lacks in direct burn damage right now, I imagine that the reach that Atrocity grants to decks might even be appreciated by control decks. If you and your opponent are just spending their turns removing each other's threats over and over again until one of you finally gets a big threat to stick, having your threat be twice as threatening, using Atrocity is going to be the key to victory in those matchups, or being able to use a mid-range unit to get that last little bit of burn damage is something that an aggressive deck is going to want as well. Don't forget that you can combine Atrocity with Mist's Call in the later parts of the game as well, where you sacrifice your unit and then bring it right back. So I think that about covers my thoughts on the most underrated and underutilized cards of the current set. So were there some cards that I picked up on that you disagree with? Or maybe there were some cards that you felt should have been included? Let me know in the comments below. I'll be reading each one and responding to each one. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. You have a good one.